Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. Last time before Judy goes under the knife. Jonathan's not with us, is he? No, I shall have to do my own co-chairing. Right, thank you for joining us again, and I'll let Judy make a start.
Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Just to say, in view of all the exciting and rather sad things that have been happening, I think we just acknowledge that we are living in fascinating historical times, and I think we are all glued to the television and watching things happening and watching things develop, and it's a privilege, isn't it, to be here and able to take part in such a dramatic turn of affairs. A new king. I don't think we're going to believe it until the stamps and the coins are produced, and then that will be really quite a shock. I think we're all feeling quite a shock to our systems in a way, thinking that the Queen was going to go on forever. And this is fascinating that we are living in such, well, as they say, living in such interesting times. So Anglo-Saxon England, personalities, well, it isn't all going to be personalities, it's sort of background as well. The early years of settlement, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes invaded. We don't know the details of when they brought their families over, but obviously it was done in stages. The warriors came first, and then they would have sent for their families. Something I didn't mention last week, which is a very important aspect of our knowledge of Anglo-Saxon England, is the value of a very modern science, DNA testing, which is throwing up all sorts of interesting discoveries and conclusions about the invasions and the settlement of this country by the foreign tribes, the sometimes called the Germanic tribes. Only a fortnight ago, I read somewhere that DNA testing has revealed that we've hardly got any Roman in history. And people say, well, what happened to the Romans? They were here for hundreds of years. What happened to them? And of course, the Romans as such didn't actually come here. It was multicultural. The Roman army was extremely multicultural. There weren't many actual Italians to think that they were all from Italy, but they weren't. Every place that every area of Europe that they conquered, they then had people joining their army to be Roman citizens. And so DNA has thrown up this interesting result that people have got Celtic ancestors, but not Roman ancestors, which implies a great deal of intermarriage anyway. And the same thing has happened with the Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah.
They intermarried with the Celtic people at quite an early stage, which is also interesting. I tended to think that there were two separate people, two separate groups of people. DNA has produced some very, very interesting results. And as more Anglo-Saxon cemeteries are discovered, they're able to do more and more DNA testing and discovering more and more of that side of that kind of science. So the early years of settlement. We know that they created settlements. We know that they brought over their own religious beliefs, and place name evidence is very valuable. Very few Celtic place names have survived. Names of one or two rivers, one or two mountains, one or two sort of physical features of the landscape, but Roman names, yes, Roman names ending with Chester or Castor, Winchester, Lancaster. Britain became Angleland, and therefore, there's Jonathan, and therefore England. The Eastern Angle tribe settled in East Anglia, and there were two groups. North folk gave its name to Norfolk, the South folk gave its name to Suffolk, which is why those two counties are spelt oddly. The Saxons then settled in various areas in the south, so we can track the Saxons quite easily. South Saxons gave their name to the county of Sussex. West Saxons became Wessex, which no longer exists as a county, but is again still regarded as an area. Excuse me. Middle Saxons, Middlesex. East Saxons, Essex. And people say, what happened to the North Saxons? There weren't any North Saxons. There was a massive area of dense forest, impenetrable forest. And although the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were known as forest people, they were used to sort of heavily wooded areas, this forest defeated them. So they didn't spread north. So there isn't somewhere called Norwich or similar. There's west, east, south, and middle, no north. Lots of places, modern settlements and towns and cities end in TON. That was the origin that was created by the Saxons. Meant to defend a settlement with a stockade around it, if they were anticipating trouble. And a lot of place names end in HAM, which just meant we get the word home from it. And hamlet, it meant a settlement which was defended. They felt safe, so they didn't build a stockade. And then ing, like Erdington, means pardon me, people or tribe or family. So Erdington can be translated as the defended settlement of the tribe of Erda, or the family of Erda. So we know the name, the approximate name of the person, the Saxon leader, war leader, who decided to settle down in Erdington. He would be a warlord, we'd call him today. And Sutton means South Defended Settlement. There isn't ing in the middle, so we haven't got a name of the warlord that settled Sutton, but we know that Sutton is Anglo-Saxon because of its name. We also know, and Martin's found, I'm sure you've discovered Martin's really good at doing extra research, and there's a wonderful page 7 on your notes, of all the other Anglo-Saxon words which have been incorporated into place names. Barrow meaning wood, Barrow in Furness. Bury, bury, a fortified place, Banbury and Shaftesbury. Ford, which has its modern meaning, a shallow river crossing. Stamford. Ham we've done. Hurst, a wooded hill. Staplehurst, Chislehurst. Lee, spelt in different ways. A forest clearing, Henley, for example. Lake, mere, or M-E-R-M-A-R-M-E-R-E, lake. Well, we're used to that, Boldmere. Lake, so Cromer. N-E-Y, island, Athelney. The island which King Alfred used as a sort of headquarters for a time when he's fighting against the Vikings. Port, market town, not port as we know it, port, somewhere near a river or the sea. Bridport, it means a market town. Stead, place, Stansted. Stow, a meeting place or a holy place, Stow Market or Padstow. And then tier when we've done, wick or witch, produce of a farm. So we've got lots of Greenwich, Woolwich, Butterwick, Chiswick and Norwich. So thanks to Martin, we've got a lot more proof of Anglo-Saxon settlement. So if you live in a place with that sort of a name, you can be sure that the Anglo-Saxons had settled in that area. Culturally, they weren't really barbarians. They were warriors, very competent farmers. They wanted to come here because of the, was mentioned last meeting, the excellent farmland and land that had potential. So if they could take away some of the trees and the shrubs and so forth, which grew wild, then they could create excellent farms. So that was the attraction. That we were a good country for growing cereal crops, because we get the right amount of rain and the right amount of sun, and very good for animals, again, good balance of nature, so good quality grass, we mentioned last week, so good quality cattle producing meat and milk, and good quality upland areas for sheep, because sheep don't like being on flat land because they get foot rot. If it's badly drained land, sheep know best. They know to go onto rising land if there's a choice. They don't particularly like being on ordinary like flat fields because they tend to not drain terribly well, and sheep are very prone, I'm sure you know, are very prone to getting foot rot, for which there didn't used to be cures apart from herbal cures, which didn't usually work. So we've got enough hills and mountains to cope with large flocks of sheep. So, and timber for building. We've got everything in this country. We've got minerals, which the Romans had discovered. It was a paradise compared with North Germany, which is where they came from. So of course they were determined to come here and settle. They didn't sort of go into the Roman towns and cities and take over, for various reasons. First of all, they're a bit nervous about stone, which was probably by this time beginning to disintegrate a bit, and sort of derelict buildings. They also had done, they killed quite rather a lot of people, so they were frightened about evil, well, not evil spirits, the spirits of the dead, waiting to take revenge on them. So they kept away from the Roman towns and cities, which they had conquered. And also because they wanted to stamp their own authority on the land by establishing new communities. And also because they couldn't build in stone themselves, they built their own communities based on wood. Lots of gods and goddesses. But that doesn't mean automatically primitive and pagan, because if you think about it, the Romans had even more gods and goddesses and spirits, and so did the Greeks. And we don't think they were primitive. So the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes worshipped three main gods: Woden, Thor, and Tiw, T-I-W. Plus they worshipped the sun and the moon, rivers, trees, special places, special hills, special stones. And place names are interesting here, and I'll give us some guidance to help us through this period, which was and is still known as the Dark Ages, when we're not absolutely sure of our facts. Woden was worshipped in Wensfield, Wensbury. The pagan gods gave their names to our days of the week. Sunday, obviously, the day you worship the sun. Monday, Moon Day. Tuesday, Tuesday. Wednesday, Woden's Day. Thursday, Thor's Day. And Friday, Freya, or Freda's Day, a goddess of fertility and growth, Friday. There was a widespread belief, and Saturday, strangely, is Saturn's day, which is all left over from the Romans. And there was a widespread belief in demons and bad spirits, as we said last week. So the green man, who could be very spiteful or could be very generous. It depended. You've got to keep on the right side of these spirits. There was a belief in the evil eye, which continued for generations, and some people even today, some people in the world believe in the evil eye, a kind of curse being put upon them for some reason. And there was much use made of amulets and special protection. Certain plants could be used for protection, and certain types of jewelry, we know now, were intended to be a form of protection against evil spirits or against, well, bad luck. So Martin's found another section about Woden and a picture of him with his eye patch, so he looks like a pirate. Woden was the boss god, most powerful of the gods, associated with death and war. And the Anglo-Saxons made sacrifices to him before battles. He had a sacred animal, the wolf, and a sacred bird, the raven, sometimes shown with one eye. His special day was Wednesday, and he led the wild hunt. And this is a characteristic of quite a number of different religions. Hunters rode across the night sky on their black horses with wild black dogs, searching for non-believers to punish. It's interesting. So the people had their own belief system. They weren't so primitive that they didn't have a system. It just wasn't the same. It certainly wasn't Christian. And Christianity was the key to the change taking place in this country. And I think, again, probably we can remember from school days, the Dark Ages, kind of brushed aside as almost like we don't know anything about them properly, so we won't learn about them. And then jumping to, civilization arrives in the year 597 with St. Augustine arriving in this country, although he wasn't a saint when he arrived, he made a saint later. Augustine arrived in this country with his 40 monks, and ta-da, everything suddenly changed and everything was suddenly civilized. And we sort of joined the rest of Europe and started to make progress, which is the way we were taught things at school. The kind of not a great deal of background, just an event being described to us. So the conversion to Christianity has been studied a great deal in recent years, because the Anglo-Saxons are being kind of resurrected, if you like. There's much more emphasis on them now. Research scholars and students working to try and find out more, instead of just brushing the early Anglo-Saxons to one side as if they weren't very important at all. So by the 7th century, there were 7 separate kingdoms in this country, separate from each other, with their own coinage, their own kings, their own systems. On the other hand, it all originated from the same place, so they did have the same belief system. But there were 7 different small kingdoms, and it was known, historians call it the heptarchy. There was intermarriage of royalty, and there was intermarriage with foreign royalty. So these kingdoms were not insignificant. Well, some of them were, they were small, and they were eventually sort of incorporated into the larger ones. We'll come to that. So it was Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, all pagan. And the first really concrete historic account is the story of the conversion of the English by Augustine, later Saint Augustine, and we use Bede as our source, and he does appear to be reliable. Saint Augustine, well, we shouldn't call him Saint Augustine. Augustine was an Italian monk born in Rome. He later gained the title the Apostle to the English. And I think we can probably all remember, or many of us will remember, the story. Some people said it was a legend, but we can't prove one way or the other whether it's a story, a legend, whether it's true or not, of Pope Gregory, known as Gregory the Great, walking through the market, the open market in Rome, and walking past the area designated for buying and selling slaves, slave market, and seeing these lovely, fair-skinned, fair-haired children, stopping and asking the slave trader, who are they? Who are they? I've never seen fair-haired children like that before. Where are they from? And the slave trader saying, they're Angles, my lord, they're Angles. And the famous Latin non-Angli said, but angeli, meaning they're not angles, they look like angels. It's very interesting that despite most Italians being dark haired, dark eyes, dark hair, and slightly tanned, and same with Spanish people, they always depicted angels as being fair, blonde, which is strange. You think they would have angels that look ethnically like they look. People from the Mediterranean look at having darker hair, dark eyes, always shown as fair. There's a theory, not really accepted, but I remember reading that possibly angels are based on albinos, people who were almost shiny pale and with almost white hair. Because it's interesting that the angels are depicted in that way, that they're different from the local people. So, again, he was made a saint, Saint Gregory, but Gregory the Great commented on these children and then asked them a few more questions. Are they Christian? No, my lord, they're not, they're pagans. And then, you probably remember this, Gregory, the Pope Gregory, going back to his quarters and saying, and feeling that God was asking him something or telling him something, then there should be a mission to save these people's souls, because they were pagan and they needed to be saved. A great mission must be set up. And there's a lovely picture that Martin's found of this episode. I don't think it's very accurate, really, as an illustration of this occasion. But I think some of us remember this from school and being able to latch onto it. With all the vagueness about the Dark Ages, suddenly this is something you can sort of hold on to as something positive. And indeed, the Pope worked very quickly to organise a mission, a papal mission, to this heathen pagan land, because now he'd seen the children, he felt compelled to save them, save their parents. It had become a difficulty for him, that he'd become convinced that God was speaking to him and saying, this is now priority. You've got to go to England, send missionaries to England and rescue them, save their souls. So he turned to someone he knew, Augustine, and asked Augustine to pick 40, that was decided, sort of a special number, hand-picked monks who would be willing to come to this country, which had a bad reputation for probably undeserved savagery and fierce warriors that would not like the monks. They didn't want to be converted. In other words, they were very happy with the religion they got. They weren't going to be waiting on the beach with open arms saying, oh, thank you for coming to rescue our souls. They're going to be extremely hostile and fierce. And Augustine worked with a will. He realized that this was an important task he'd been given, and got his 40 monks and set off. Long journey in those days, obviously, from Italy to this country. And did a first miracle was in Anjou. He prayed, and a well then had curative water. There was a setback, because as they progressed through Gaul, still using its Roman name, what we call France, they heard more and more terrifying rumours and stories about how awful the English were, to use that word rather than keep saying Anglos and Saxons and Jews, how fierce they were, how they hated interference. They certainly wouldn't welcome these monks. And they'd be murdered as soon as they arrived. They would just be slaughtered on the beach. So even Augustine began to get cold feet, not surprisingly, having this, the fierceness of the people emphasized again and again by everybody they met as they journeyed on. And so Augustine was persuaded, and he didn't need much persuading apparently, to write to his master, to write to the Pope and say, well, give reasons, and then say, please may we be excused from this mission. We don't want to continue. We have got cold feet. Well, he didn't actually put it like that, of course. And the Pope wrote back, basically saying, no, you can't give up. All of Rome is praying for you. The Pope had organized that every church in Rome would put this mission top of the list when it came to prayers, and that every individual would be praying for the success of this enterprise. So Augustine had no recourse but to well, obviously he'd taken an oath of obedience to the Pope. So the mission continued, but you can imagine, and these letters have survived, which is amazing. These letters have survived, they're in the Vatican. And you can imagine with what trepidation Augustine and his band of 40 monks continued the journey as they reached the channel, and thinking, in a few days' time, we're all going to be dead, or taken prisoner and tortured, or something horrible is going to happen to us because they're pagan and they're fierce, and we've been told such terrible things about them. You can imagine how scared they must have felt. However, I think again we were told the story. They began their work in Kent, and that was obvious that you go straight across the channel, you land in Kent. It was the nearest kingdom to the continent, so it made sense that they would land like the Romans had done in Kent. It already had a Christian queen called Bertha, and she had been very generously, part of the marriage settlement, granted the right to have a church, a Christian church, her own priest and confessor, and permission from her husband, King Ethelbert of Kent, to worship Christ only. In other words, she wouldn't have to attend any pagan festivals or pagan ceremonials or anything like that, and compromise her own faith. A very, very generous agreement had been, a very generous settlement had been made as part of the marriage arrangements before the marriage took place. She could have her own church. Now, interestingly, the church she was given was St. Martin's in Canterbury, and I've mentioned it before. It's the one that sort of half of the building is Roman, and then it had been neglected and had fallen, the roof had fallen in, obviously derelict, so it hadn't been looked after. And then when you go to St. Martin's, you can clearly see where the Roman bricks stop, and then they built it and completed it later. But it's the oldest Christian church in this country. And when my daughter was at Kent University, well, they both were, but my older daughter, she had private digs, as they called them then, just a few yards away from St Martin's. And it's still called Queen's Way or Queen's Walk because Queen Bertha went there every day. She worshipped every day, heard mass every day. So there was a Christian presence, which Augustine and the monks didn't seem to be totally aware of. They wouldn't have been quite as frightened if they'd known. But we don't know why they weren't made fully aware. Perhaps because nobody quite knew, because there wasn't that much communication going on, obviously, between the Vatican, between the Pope and the King of Kent. So many of their fears were ungrounded, to their great relief. So in spring 597 AD, 40 Italian monks plus a Frankish priest interpreters, because nobody in the group spoke Anglo-Saxon, and obviously the Anglo-Saxons, the English, didn't speak Latin, so it was going to be quite tricky to communicate. So they picked up some people as they travelled through Gaul, which was now turning into France, because being occupied by the Franks, another barbarian tribe, gave its name to France. They brought them along as interpreters. And famously, the king agreed to meet these monks, these missionaries, we could call them by now. They are missionaries. And he agreed to meet them. I mean, what would have happened if he'd refused? We don't quite know. If he'd said, you know, turn back immediately or I'm setting my troops on you. But he didn't. He agreed to meet them. Interestingly, because he was a pagan, he wouldn't meet them indoors because he thought that they had special powers. He acknowledged that they've probably got special powers and they might cast a spell on him or damage him in some way. So he agreed to meet them under an oak tree because he believed that oaks had special powers, protective powers, the strongest, sturdiest trees and the longest lasting. The oaks live for a very, very long time and they don't blow down in gales like some trees. So that emphasized the fact that he was a pagan, that he agreed to meet them under an oak tree. And Martin's found one of the many, many pictures of this happening, one of the illustrations of Augustine preaching to the king, and the king has got his back against the tree for not just for comfort and support, but literally. So the power of the tree would be supporting him and helping him and literally protecting him. But he listened. Again, very important that he agreed to listen to what Augustine was saying. He listened to him preaching. And Augustine had brought, very sensibly, gifts from the Pope. A beautiful big silver cross and a large picture of Christ, the Saviour. And they also sang to the king, plain chant, presumably, Gregorian chant. And they sang to the king, and he didn't turn away in horror and say, I don't want to listen to this. And the king openly showed that he was impressed by this delegation, as far as he was concerned. It's kind of a delegation. These people had come to see him from a very long way away. He was quite impressed by the fact they'd travelled so far. So it made him feel important that they had been willing to travel for many months to reach England. But he didn't convert immediately. You wouldn't expect that he would. He was a king. He was cautious. He wanted to wait and see and learn more. But very generously, he gave them somewhere to live in Canterbury. He gave them lodgings. Again, it was the Church of St Martin. And he also, even more, very much more importantly, he gave them permission to preach. He didn't throw them out, as everyone had expected. He didn't take any of them hostage. He didn't torture anybody or keep them short of food. He treated them as if they were, nowadays, I suppose, a trade delegation. Treated them with courtesy, which was certainly not what they'd expected. So the prayers in Rome had been answered, and the missionaries had been given far more than they'd expected from a generous king. Now, we don't know how much influence Queen Bertha had over her husband. There are legends about this, or stories about this as well, which can't be proved one way or the other. But probably she had a great deal of influence over her husband. It was thought to be a happy marriage, thought to be arranged, but it's worked out well. And that she was probably, well, not probably, very likely, encouraging her husband to find out more about the Christian faith before he made the decision. And he did make the decision. Amazingly, Pentecost Sunday, which is in May, King Ethelbert was formally baptized with many of his noblemen. They were called thanes. And that meant that he had officially declared that he would like Kent to become a Christian kingdom. And according to Bede, 10,000 of his subjects were baptized on one occasion in a small Kentish river. The number does sound amazing, and we have to be a little bit cautious with numbers, because sometimes people just reach for a number to say lots of people. So we don't know whether somebody actually counted them, whether they stood in serried ranks of 10 or 100, and then somebody could easily calculate how many there were. But certainly an impressive large number of Kentish men agreed to be baptized and had learned enough about the new faith to be convinced that they were making the right decision. And as a result, and again, we're into the land of, do we believe this? Do we not believe it? Is this a legend? Many healings and miracles and visions then took place. Obviously, we can't prove that one way or the other by DNA or archaeology or anything like that. Archaeology, in a way, does play a part. I'll just say now that what has happened again through metal detecting, more Anglo-Saxon grave cemeteries have been discovered, burial grounds, and you can tell an awful lot from graves, even the position of the body. Once the people became Christian, they wanted to be buried facing the east for the second coming of Christ. So the alignment of the body, the skeleton, is very significant. And you may have learned this at school. In the early days, in Celtic times, there were cremations. People were buried, their bones or remains, ashes were put in jars, and then there were burials with grave goods. And this is what's so brilliant for archaeologists, that a pagan grave is much better to find from the archaeology point of view than a Christian grave, because people believed, as the ancient Egyptians did, that you needed lots of stuff to take into the next life. So if you find a pagan Anglo-Saxon cemetery, you're digging up lots of amazing pots and pots in the case of a lady, jewelry. Ladies were buried with their jewelry. Sometimes with devices like looms for weaving, something that they had done during their life. They thought they would continue to do it in the next life. Warriors, of course, were buried with their war gear, it was called, their helmets and their shields and their spears and axes, and sometimes a horse. They actually buried a horse if he was a warlord. And then if you find a graveyard where there are no grave goods, just bodies facing east, Christian. So you can work out a great deal actually from archaeology and the positioning of the cemeteries. And sometimes you get a mixture. You get some people that were still pagan that had got grave goods in their grave, and next to somebody who hadn't got anything like that at all, and were positioned it facing east. So obviously Christianity didn't just kind of sweep the country, go through the seven kingdoms, which we were sort of told at school. There was an implication that once Kent had turned Christian, within a few, well, almost weeks, the rest of the kingdoms became Christian, and that certainly wasn't true. The mission to Kent was a real success. There's no doubt about that. Augustine became an archbishop. He went to Gaul in 598 and was created archbishop. He was the first archbishop of Canterbury, primate of the English Church, and many of his monks became saints. St. Lawrence, second archbishop, St. Peter, the first abbot, St. Mellitus, third archbishop, St. Justus, fourth archbishop, and St. Paulinus. You may have learned about him at school. He went up to Northumbria. He was the first bishop of York, and Northumbria was converted. If you go to York Minster, which I did frequently as a child, because my mother liked history, and so probably a reason why I like history so much. We went to York regularly from Leeds, went on a bus, and we always went to the Minster, and in the undercroft, sort of in the cellar, if you like, of the Minster, there is an altar with a sort of half a basin. It was like a wash basin made of alabaster coming out from the wall. And when I was little, I used to think, I wonder why there's a wash basin down here, but highly decorated and with candles on either side. When I was older, I realized, well, I didn't realize, the guidebook said that was where King Edwin of Northumbria was baptized, but it wasn't in a building then, it was a spring. And then when they built the first minster of wood, they incorporated the spring and sort of built something over it to protect it, because it was seen as holy. That was the spring that had been used for the water to baptize King Edwin. So the beginning of Christianity in the north of England. Well, it wasn't actually, we'll come back to that. And then over years it had become more and more elaborated and spectacular, although it was underneath. I used to think it was quite exciting going into the basement of a cathedral to see this special place where Christianity, the Roman form of Christianity, had developed in the north, and thinking, well, it just made me think about all sorts of things. That there's this great minster had been built over this spring, and that's why York Minster is where it is, because of this spring that had been used for the water for the baptism of King Edwin. And Augustine went on to found a school, a monastery in Canterbury, and a diocese in London, in the kingdom of the East Saxons. He did an enormous amount, which is why he was made into a saint. And he wrote regularly to the Pope about developments. And the letters have survived. It's just absolutely amazing to think these letters from so long ago are in the Vatican Library, perfectly preserved. So this correspondence, one of the letters particularly, or several of the letters particularly, Augustine was a worrier. He was a great organizer and a dynamic character, but he worried about things, as a lot of us do. He wasn't sure that the people had been properly converted, and he had reason for his fears. This happened a great deal in the story of the conversion of the different, the 7 kingdoms, that people would say that they'd become Christian, and they were baptized, either in a river or they liked it to be flowing water, so moving water. But sometimes they did resort to a pool or a lake, but they preferred to use a river or a spring. People would say they were Christian, and they would start fulfilling Christian duties and going to church, etc. But actually, they were hedging their bets. A lot of the early Christians were also worshipping the gods that they were, their traditional gods, Thor, Woden, etc.
Pragmatic.
they were, they were keeping her foot in both camps. Yes, in their view, this was sensible. Because one thing that I think I mentioned last week, one thing that they found, and the Vikings had the same problem, they didn't understand why Jesus hadn't resisted arrest, why he had allowed himself to be crucified. They didn't get that. They found that difficult. And the fact that he'd actually preached, if a man smite you on one cheek, offer the other cheek. If a man takes your coat, offer him your cloak also. The teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and talking about being humble and like a servant. The culture of the Anglo-Saxons was not to be subservient and not to give in and to take revenge. And if somebody did something horrible to you, you did something horrible back. So, and the other thing, of course, is that they were afraid that if they gave up their pagan gods, their gods, I mean, they didn't think they were pagan, their gods, they would start to lose battles, and their harvest would be terrible because they defended their god of harvest and fertility. So, yeah, they hedged their bets. So a lot of the grave goods that have been discovered, and certainly in the Sutton Hoo hoard, you found crosses. People were wearing crosses. They were wearing like people do today, or a crucifix. But then next to it, and the famous one that they found at Sutton Hoo, when they found it, they thought, oh, they're great. You know, the king here was Christian. We found a cross on a chain. Next to it was what was like a Tau cross, you know, a T-shaped cross. And then on the further examination, when it was all cleaned up, they discovered it was Thor's hammer. So they got a cross, so they worshipped Christ, but they'd also got Thor's hammer, so they were still worshipping Thor. So they were well and truly kind of insurance. Christian, nominally Christian, but still paying, well, not just respect, but worshipping Thor, so that they were covering all eventualities. And some of them were still worshipping the goddess of harvest. So Augustine was very concerned about this, but he said they're still continuing with their pagan festivals and rituals, and they've got all these superstitions which are non-Christian, and they keep telling them they've got to abandon all these. They must worship Christ and the one God. What do I do? What can I do? What do I punish them? Shall I punish them? Shall I organize punishments? And Augustine wrote back very quickly and said, no, whatever you do not punish them. They are like babies. You've got to nurture them. You've got to be kind and sympathetic to them. No punishments. Or no saying that they're going to go to hell when they die, or frightening them. They're new in faith. They're like babies. And he said, they've got to be weaned off milk like babies have to be, and put onto solid food. What a sensible man. Go gently with them. But he said, one way around this problem is to convert the pagan custom into a Christian custom. That shouldn't be too difficult for a clever man like you. And gave him a few words of, a few suggestions. And that is really what happened. And that's what's still happening, if you think about it. Harvest Festival, for example, well, not worshipping, but saying thank you for the crops in the autumn, and that the crops are being safely gathered in. Harvest is taking place, and people have got enough food for the winter. And many churches have a Harvest Festival service, but that was actually a pagan service, thanking the pagan gods for the crop. So the Pope said, well, you just change it slightly and just say, well, you're giving thanks to God for the good harvest. All sorts of just tweaking. We call it tweaking today, just tweaking something and making it Christian rather than pagan. He said, don't make them abandon all these rituals. That's too harsh, and you'll lose them. They'll revert to pagan. Such good advice. Plough Monday, for example, blessing the plough, so the plough will produce good crops. well, will help the soil, and the soil will produce good harvests. A lot of churches have reintroduced, in country areas, have reintroduced a special blessing of the ploughshares, and that was originally pagan. And the May Queen fertility festival, Whitsuntide, very pagan, a fertility rite. Even that was sort of converted into, well, you're worshipping the Queen of Heaven, you're worshipping the Virgin Mary. Easter is actually called after a pagan goddess called Eostra. So what a sensible Pope, and Augustine willing to listen to the Pope and follow instructions, follow orders. It worked very well indeed. But we still have many aspects of our lives that are pagan. I mentioned last week touching wood. We've still got a lot of superstitions, and we don't even realise our superstitions. The conversion was piecemeal. That needs to be emphasised. When we learned it at school, as I said, it looked as though once Augustine had succeeded in Kent, the other kingdoms followed suit. And it wasn't like that at all. That's just a quick and easy way of teaching history to children. Northumbria, yes, although they later reverted. Mercia, the Midlands, yes, became Christian. And then under King Penda, famously, was a fierce opponent of Christianity. Lapsed, that's prejudice, depends which side you're on, went back to being pagan. We tend to think that was retrograde and terrible. Sussex was the last kingdom to convert, partly because, again, they were cut off by a vast forest. So they were the last to be sort of got at by Christian missionaries. It was a backward sort of kingdom anyway, compared with the others. And they were the last, famously, they were the last to turn to Christianity. And we know from looking at grave goods that it wasn't a done deal. They kept, you could say, lapsing. They kept going back to their pagan ways, or kings did. And the people tended to just follow whatever the king decided. So if the king was Christian, it didn't necessarily mean that the people understood Christianity. They just went along with whatever the king said. Then if he went back to being pagan, fine, they went back to being pagan. Oh, they'd probably been pagan all the time. They hadn't been actually instructed properly. So it wasn't as neat and tidy as we were told at school, that all of a sudden the people of this country became Christian worshippers. It didn't work that way at all. However, it did make a huge difference. That is genuine, that is true, historically true, that becoming Christian meant that we were linked with Christendom, Christ's kingdom. Very importantly, we became part of Christian Europe. Europe was going through the same situation, really. Some areas had become Christian, some not. And this book, which is called The Origins of the Anglo-Saxons, lovely phrase, easy to remember. Christianity brought literacy, learning, and Latin, the language of the church. Literacy, learning, and Latin. So it did make a huge difference. It wasn't just a change of, it wasn't a change in the belief system. It was a change, most people would say, for the better. That a lot of people have argued that that was when we emerged from the Dark Ages. You know, if you want to actually still use this phrase, and some historians still do, that was the end of the Dark Ages, because literacy meant that there would be records kept, as the Romans had done. People would be able to keep proper written accounts and records, tax returns, etc. And I'll just read straight from this book. The monasteries developed scriptoria, where books were laboriously copied by hand and often illuminated with decorated initial letters, something we are very aware of because we've got the Lichfield Gospels. We've got the wonderful books in the British Library, the Lindisfarne Gospels, absolutely amazingly illustrated, certainly not by primitive people with no skills at all, absolutely amazing. So it is often illuminated with decorated initial letters or full-page depictions related to the text. They would be beautifully bound in decorated leather. The unique pocket gospel found in the tomb of St. Cuthbert, when his remains were translated to Durham in 1104, retains its original red goatskin binding with an appealing combination of interlace and plant scroll decoration. Scribes could use a stylus to scratch letters on a wax tablet for everyday purposes, but books were written on vellum, which was animal skin, which had been soaked, stretched, and scraped clean. One of the most valuable books held by York Minster is the York Gospels. It is thought to have been written around the turn of the first millennium in the scriptorium of St. Augustine's Monastery, Canterbury, and then brought to York by Archbishop Wulfstan in around 1020. Now DNA analysis has established that it was written on expensive parchment made of calf skin. It was a few surviving bristles that revealed that the same is true of the famous Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most magnificent manuscripts of the time in all of Europe. So that does seem sudden and amazing that we were in the Dark Ages, illiterate, etc. And suddenly there's this sort of outpouring of amazing skill. And that's what we'll talk about next week, and certain saints, because what we haven't done is mention the Celtic saints who were busy converting people. It isn't true that St. Augustine came to a completely ignorant land, the Kingdom of Kent, that they knew nothing at all about Christianity until he arrived, or the other missionaries arrived. A lot of us know the names of Celtic saints because they give their names to places like St. Ives, Felixstowe, St. Felix, who converted large areas of Suffolk. So we're going to look at the Celtic saints next time, when I'm hopefully recovered. And their contribution was massive. The only problem with the Celtic saints is very confusing mixture of fact and fiction. Lots of legends about the Celtic saints. And I know I keep mentioning the same one, St. Brendan, who apparently was able to sail in a stone boat or on a leaf, which we don't really believe, do we? The Celtic saints, you know, there's some of the miracles they performed, and some of the places you know, like surviving some absolutely ages without any food, or well, we'll do that next time. Exciting stories, and some of them, of course, genuine successes in converting areas. So it certainly wasn't all the monks from Rome. So we'll concentrate on certain outstanding saints like Aidan and Cuthbert, and say the Celtic, and Patrick, of course, St. Patrick. We'll concentrate on them next time. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you for your loyalty. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Bye.
And on behalf of everyone, we wish you well. We should be thinking of you, and for those of us that do, offering the prayers for a speedy recovery and a speedy resumption of our fascinating insight into the funny goings on of our ancestors. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you for your support.